Welcome to the Bible Forum. I'm Warren Sprouse. Have you ever run into people who fancy themselves a Bible scholar? They've read the Bible, they've been to church, they've got maybe some training under their belt, and they begin to give you advice. I want to talk to you about a biblical worldview debunked. This comes from BenjaminLCorey.com. Benjamin Corey is an author, a speaker, a scholar, and a global traveler. He holds degrees in theology and intercultural studies from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and a doctorate in intercultural studies from Fuller Seminary. He calls himself a former fundamentalist, but is now opposing the religious right. If you don't know what a fundamentalist is, regardless of what field of study or where you might find that term used, it always means the same thing. They believe the fundamentals of whatever it is they're talking to you about or whatever they're doing. He says, I grew up a love child of the religious right and Rush Limbaugh. But as a man in my 40s, I now find myself in a much different place. I have no doubt those of my youth must feel I have rejected everything I was ever taught and abandoned the Christian faith. However, the reality is I am more sure of my Christian faith than ever. The ultimate irony is that I didn't walk away because I rejected the core principles I was taught. The relationship ended because they rejected the core principles they had long taught me. And in reflection, here are 10 reasons I dumped the religious right and moved into the Christian left. Not because I rejected what they taught me, but because I still believe it. The author continues to lay out a series of debates he has apparently had with those from whom he has parted company. And the debates are classic. I want you to listen to them, and I want you to consider how you would have answered this doubter's questions. He says, I reject the religious right's scripture-twisting and bizarre use of the Bible. The religious right taught me that as Christians we ought to support policies and political leaders that reflect a commitment to biblical principles and values. In due time, however, I discovered they just meant being anti-abortion and anti-marriage equality, even though neither issue is directly and explicitly addressed in the Bible in the way some would like them to be. So, the minute I began asking about issues the Bible actually does explicitly address, the truth of what they really believe became more evident. And they quickly engaged the type of scripture gymnastics they always warned me about. Question. But didn't Jesus speak out against the use of violence and tell us to love our enemies? Now, apparently, this particular critic is talking about those enemies of America and enemies of American values like China, Russia, and Iran. And doesn't this mean we are to receive any and all who come to us? He says, doesn't the Old Testament command the government to tax citizens in order to support those in poverty and immigrants? And doesn't it command us to welcome immigrants? The supposed classic answer from fundamentalists, he says, is, well, yes, but that was the Old Testament, you see, so not all of that applies today. But didn't you just say it all still applies? And he says at that point, the fundamentalists are quiet. The truth here is the Old Testament law governed the affairs of Jews and what they did in terms of taxes and so forth. It was all for their people. It wasn't for the world. Of course, Gentiles could convert to Judaism and thereby enjoy the benefits. In today's situation, it would be like requiring immigrants to join our nation and embrace our values before we embrace them as equal citizens. Oh wait, that's what we used to do before the anarchists opened the doors to any and all comers with no strings attached. And all that started when? About 20 years ago or so, under new policies forged by liberals and progressives. Question: doesn't the New Testament command us to care for the poor and welcome immigrants? And the answer is yes, it does. But we should do that individually as we are able. God tells us how we should act, but doesn't mean the government has the right to force us to act that way. Jesus never told the government how to do its job. Mr. Corey says, but didn't you just start out by saying when it comes to gay marriage and abortion, the government should make us behave in certain ways? Nobody said that. What they said was America has no legal requirement to take in any and all who want to come. You see, Mr. Corey believes today's religious right embraces moral relativism. He says, maybe I'm just getting old, but I remember the days when we believed that core moral principles don't just change with the times. But as Trumpianity has taken over American Christianity, somehow morality is a far more flexible term than it used to be. He says, as a kid, I was repeatedly warned that those who engage in immoral talk, sexual immorality, lovers of money, and liars and so forth, were destined for the fires of hell. Today, I believe that right is right and wrong is wrong, and that those things don't change just because your guy is in power. Mr. Corey went on to reference the early life and subsequent ministry of Jesus in terms of today's migrants, saying that Jesus was a brown-skinned child refugee who grew up to be a homeless transient and who ultimately died an unarmed person of color, killed by police force. Now, before I start talking about that, I want you to know none of that's true. Not one word. Being an itinerant preacher is not the same as a homeless transient. And as far as being a refugee, he went to Egypt as a boy. His parents took him to Egypt to avoid being murdered. That's not the same thing. And some years later, they came back once the danger had passed. Jesus was not an unnamed person of color. He was a Jewish rabbi, a religious teacher, known and respected by a multitude of people. He had a pedigree that went back to King David and beyond. He was unlawfully tried and sentenced to death, a penalty executed by the legal authority of that day, Rome. And when he died, the entire world at that time took notice. I believe that clothing the poor, feeding the hungry, healing the sick, remembering those in prison, and welcoming immigrants are heaven and hell issues. I believe in the sanctity of human life and that all people have sacred value and worth to God. The religious right, he says, on the other hand, has never supported consistent policies that uphold the belief all life is sacred. It's one of the beliefs I now realize they never believed in the first place. I believe in the importance of compassion and couldn't find the compassion in today's conservatism. The religious right has inexplicably become the people leading the way in arguing that we must ignore personal character and morality when selecting our leaders. Enter stage left, Donald Trump. I categorically reject that character does count. Character has always counted. Character still counts. Of course, the question becomes like Bill Clinton, Barack Obama. He says, I am pro-family and believe the government has a responsibility to protect families and children. The religious right has literally built an entire movement on the supposed belief that the government must protect innocent children, and that as Christians we need to protect the family the family unit, until it is the foundation of society. The religious right isn't pro-child or pro-family by any stretch of the imagination, but I still am, and always will be. And this is where his views expose his inconsistencies. Once those kids go from unborn to just born, all of a sudden government involvement is overreach, taxation is theft, and rugged individualism is the argument that wins the day. And should those families turn out to be brown-skinned immigrants, all of a sudden the family unit doesn't matter. Breaking them up is of no concern. And permanently traumatizing children is justified because, after all, we're a nation of laws. He says, I believe Christians are called to be people who look after the needs of others. Jesus said that he saw them and was filled with compassion. If anyone wants to be like Jesus, being filled with compassion when witnessing the suffering of others is one of the requirements. Anyone who supports having kids locked in cages, he's talking about illegals flooding our southern border. Anyone who could see such a sight and not be flooded with compassion and want to instantly free them from their oppressors is not only lacking in compassion, but such a person has no right to associate themselves with Jesus in any way, shape, or form. Now keep in mind, he conveniently ignores the rule of law that guarantees our rights as well as our survival as a nation. One liberal spokeswoman has come forward to say they will take in 10 or 15 of these children. Oh wait, no, that didn't happen, did it? We don't have people willing to take these children, these people. We can't handle this many people at our border. And private individuals can't handle 10 or 15 children in their home. You get it? Mr. Corey's sermon continues by saying, I don't care what party you belong to, what flavor of Christian you are, or how you approach reading the Bible. If you've actually read the Bible and missed the constant theme from start to finish of God's people being called to be those who care for the needs of others, you need to try again. I would call that hypocrisy. And I think the liberal left are masters of hypocrisy. The scandals that surround these people are legion and historical. Just this week, a major Democrat in Congress has been found to have 2 corporations, one nonprofit, the other for-profit. Both corporations carry the same name, are owned by he and his wife. Millions of dollars over decades of time have flowed through these instruments without a single word of criticism or complaint. Until now. Now with a Republican president who doesn't care about politics. Oh, he uses politics, but his main focus is winning. His main focus is success and profit. Not for him, not now, but for the nation he has sworn to protect and preserve. Mr. Corey says, now more than ever, I still believe that character counts, and that the religious right may have forgotten the 90s, but I haven't. In the 90s, we shouted character counts from the rooftops and insisted the moral character of our political leaders was critically important because individual morality impacts individual leadership. Methinks Mr. Corey has forgotten the 1980s, the Clinton era. He has forgotten the Democrat president who preceded Mr. Clinton, who was about as immoral as they come. And now we're learning about the first president of the 21st century era and his pay-for-play schemes. Think Vice President Biden and his first trip abroad as president, when he visited every major Islamic nation, bowing to the leaders, both civil and religious. How he took his wife at first, but then sent her home when he visited the more religiously fundamental imams and civil leaders. Mr. Corey asked, today's religion, today's religious right, well, it certainly isn't the group who demonstrates they believe the Apostle Paul when he tells us we should not only look after the needs of others, but that we ought to humble ourselves enough to see others as being more important than ourselves. But he says, who still believes that? He says, I do. Well, I want to know what that means, don't you? Does it mean Mr. Corey is ready and willing to give all he has to those who break into his home looking for a place to live and to eat? Well, perhaps. But all that's highly unlikely. And does that make him a hypocrite? Well, if he believes what he seems to be telling us, the answer is yes. But liberals, religious or political, have always lived in a very flexible world. And Mr. Corey is a certified liberal. His theological training shouts it. He went from being a fundamentalist to intercultural studies at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, to a doctorate in intercultural studies at Fuller. These are certified and certifiably theologically liberal schools. Mr. Corey's journey was from so-called fundamentalist churches to highly liberal colleges and seminaries. That doesn't happen in real life, unless one or more of three things are present. The churches were not really very fundamental. Secondly, he rebelled against his fundamental training. Thirdly, he sought worldly acclaim and acceptance through his education. But all this is the same story. We've heard it over and over for 60 years. People who play at church, sending their children off to the best schools, finding those children corrupted, warped by clever and highly intelligent professors, then reproducing themselves in ever more liberal environmental schools, all the while insisting that we, the academically unwashed, are the real problem. Mr. Corey is confused. He's confused about what he sees, what he hears, and he's confused about what he's saying. And one day, he'll wake up to the realization of all of that confusion. We trust it won't be too late.